the morning of the 23rd of January 1901, Britain woke up to hear that the old Queen, the Queen Empress, Queen Victoria, was dead. Victoria had reigned for nearly 64 years. She was the most famous woman in the world, and it felt like a world was over.
Victoria died in bed, surrounded by her family. She was clasping a crucifix. If it was there to ward off evil spirits, it didn't work, because she died in the arms of her grandson, the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, a man who would do his bit to ensure that the new century was the bloodiest in human history, with Victoria's British in the thick of it. From the death of Queen Victoria to the end of the Second World War is a paltry space of time, just 44 years. And yet, during it, this country was shaken from top to toe.
The empire tottered. Women won the vote. Democracy came of age. And we fought 2 apocalyptic world wars to defend it.
Dark, funny, surprising, and not so long ago, these are the years when modern Britain was born.
These people were our grandparents and great-grandparents. But if we could travel through time to meet them, would we feel at home in their Britain? Fabulous wealth was spilling from roaring, belching cities. But millions went hungry, really hungry, gaunt hungry. Shoeless children could be seen on the streets of every town. We weren't a democracy. Only a quarter of the adult population had the right to vote, all of them men. Government brimmed with aristocrats. The Tory Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, was a very clever but darkly pessimistic reactionary who privately referred to voters as vermin. Like Queen Victoria, he was, above all, a figure of empire. Britain still ruled a quarter of the world's people, after all. But for how long? In 1901, British troops were fighting a brutal war over the gold-rich territories of South Africa. The Boer War was fought between the largest empire in the history of the world and a small force of untrained Dutch farmers, or Boers.
The British Army arrived here, supremely convinced they were going to give the Boers a damned good thrashing. They were dressed in their latest cunning uniform, coloured dust, or to use the Indian word, khaki. They had their sabres and their lances and rather old-fashioned rifles. The Boers, on the other hand, had the latest German rifles. They knew how to dig trenches, and they understood the terrain intimately. 19th century cavalry warfare was about to meet 20th century guerrilla fighters. And somebody was about to get a thrashing.
Running the show was Joseph Chamberlain, the man bestriding British politics, a master rabble-rouser, and the most fervent imperialist in the high noon of empire. Chamberlain had built his political power base in Birmingham as a radical liberal before moving sharply to the right. He'd split his own party and joined the Tories.
Joe Chamberlain was a self-made man. He'd made his millions manufacturing screws in Birmingham, but he was also self-made for the new media age. With his swish velvet coat, a white orchid in the lapel, and his monocle, as famous in its day as Margaret Thatcher's handbag or Winston Churchill's cigar.
Chamberlain believed that the new century could be British, with the empire expanding and dominating the whole world. In 1901, for most British people, this seemed perfectly possible, and they looked to Joe to lead them.
Chamberlain was a political whirlwind. In Churchill's phrase, the man who made the weather. And now he was conjuring up a storm meant to expand empire abroad and overturn the old politics at home.
The Boer War was known as Joe's War. Chamberlain was confident of victory. But the Boers were outmanoeuvring the British, ambushing the army and then disappearing into the hills. The conflict was turning into Imperial Britain's very own Vietnam. Joe called for drastic measures, and Commander-in-Chief Lord Kitchener was the man to take them.
In order to flush out the guerrillas, Kitchener created a vast barbed wire net spreading right across the country with 8,000 defensive blockhouses like this one at every corner. British forces swept through the countryside, killing cattle and sheep, burning crops. There were 30,000 undefended Boer farmhouses. Every single one of them was burned to the ground.
This destruction left thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, homeless. But Lord Kitchener had a plan for them as well.
The British Army rounded up around 160,000 women and children, crammed them into wagons or railway trucks, and transported them to hastily improvised refugee camps, which, guarded by the army, quickly became outdoor prisons, and then, thanks to military incompetence, not by design, they became places of horror. Kitchener's policy gave the world a new phrase: concentration camps.
In December 1900, a young Cornish woman called Emily Hobhouse came to South Africa to deliver food and clothing to the camps. She found women and children living in tents under the relentless sun, starvation rations, terrible sanitation, swarms of flies everywhere. Stepping into one tent, Hobhouse came across an 8-year-old girl called Lizzie Van Zyl. On the verge of starvation, she was dying of typhoid.
Emily Hobhouse decided it was her duty to tell the people of Britain exactly what was being done out here in their name. And she spoke plainly. She talked of wholesale cruelty. murder to the children, and a war of extermination. And Emily Hobhouse was proved horribly right. 26,000 Boer women and children died in British concentration camps. 80% of them under the age of 16.
Back in Britain, a powerful anti-war movement was mobilising. It was led by the Liberal Party's rising star, David Lloyd George, the first British politician to be the subject of a biopic. In December 1901, he was invited to address an anti-war meeting in Birmingham's Town Hall. This was the heart of Joe Chamberlain's political power, and Lloyd George had the Liberal turncoat in his sights.
This was too good an opportunity to miss, but the police told Lloyd George on no account to go to Birmingham. His appearance here would cause a riot. There were people in Birmingham who wanted to kill him. Joe Chamberlain was rubbing his hands with glee. If Lloyd George wants his life, he'd better stay away, he said. And then he twisted the political knife. If he doesn't come, I'll see that everyone knows he's afraid. If he does, he deserves all he gets.
But Lloyd George didn't flinch. On December the 18th, 1901, he boldly stepped onto the stage of the Birmingham Town Hall. But before he could open his mouth, an angry pro-war mob, 30,000 strong, smashed all the town hall windows, broke down the door, and stormed in. 2 men were killed in the crush, many more were injured.
Lloyd George only managed to escape the mob by disguising himself as a policeman, helmet and all, and sneaking out of a side entrance. Back down in London, a vengeful Joe Chamberlain was lurking in his club, waiting for news. When he heard that Lloyd George had escaped, he was bitterly disappointed.
The Boers finally surrendered in May 1902. It had taken 2.5 years, the equivalent of £20 billion, and an army of 250,000 British soldiers to defeat 60,000 Boer farmers.
And so David had given Goliath one heck of a kicking, and there was a massive national crisis of confidence. Then it was revealed that almost half of the men who'd volunteered for South Africa were unfit to fight. They were sick or too weak. Pamphlets began to appear asking, "Can England survive the century?" or "What should England do to be saved?" The British Empire still stood as tall, but perhaps now wobbling a bit on feet of clay.
Perhaps to save ourselves, we'd have to go back to nature. The scientist Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin's, believed we could breed better Britons. Galton found his inspiration in the Basset Hound Club Rules and Stud Book.
Come on.
He read that each individual puppy inherited its unique set of splodges and colours from its parents. Galton came to the conclusion that our genetic inheritance also dictated our fate, and that nothing could alter it. Not upbringing, not education.
According to Galton, the poorest classes had little or no civic worth or value and no chance of getting better, so they should be discouraged from breeding. Criminals should be segregated and forbidden from reproducing, but the upper and middle classes, brimming with vigour and intelligence and virtue should be encouraged to have as many children as possible. For Galton, human equality was meaningless.
The ravings of a lone eccentric. Absolutely not. This was an age of science, and Galton was a scientific superstar. Cabinet ministers, bishops, and influential writers, many of them on the left, thought he was the man who could save Britain with his new science of human advancement, eugenics.
George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and Britain's leading public intellectual of the time, said that nothing short of a eugenic religion would save Britain from moral decline. We must never hesitate, he went on, to carry out the negative aspect of eugenics with considerable zest, both on the scaffold and on the battlefield. And these ideas went international. Scandinavians and Americans carried Galton's ideas back with them. So did Germans, who formed the Racial Hygiene Society. From the Bassettown stud book to Auschwitz in not many bounds, Francis Galton's eugenics was among modern Britain's more doubtful exports.
Thankfully, at just the same moment, there were other thinkers at work. Saturday, the 7th of July, 1900, was a hot, sticky day in the narrow back streets of York. At first light, a shadowy figure stood holding a notebook, watching the door of a small, dirty pub.
By 6 a.m, people were already rattling the door of the public house. Everybody who went in, everyone who came out, was duly noted down in the little book. In all, 550 people went in, 113 of them children. Children simply abound here, the investigator wrote. I count no less than 13 sitting on the public house steps and the pavement.
The Observer was one of a team of private inspectors in an investigation into the living conditions of the poor. The project was the brainchild of a wealthy Quaker called Seabohm Rowntree, a member of the sweets and chocolate family.
As the inspectors delved deeper and deeper into the back streets of York, their anger and nausea began to smoke from the statistics and the dry notes. Dirty flock bedding in living room placed on box and 2 chairs, smell of room from dirt and bad air unbearable. Nearby, 16 families were sharing one water tap. The grating under the water tap is used for the disposal of human excreta and was partially blocked with it when inspected.
The rich had always blamed the poor for bringing poverty upon themselves by being idle or feckless. But Rowntree's study demonstrated in cold statistical fact that people slipped into poverty for many different reasons.
The poor were victims. They weren't genetic failures. They were women without an income who'd been widowed or deserted. They were people broken by ill health or old age, unable to work, or they were in work but simply weren't being paid enough to keep themselves and their families decently. Rowntree's book, published in 1901 and called simply Poverty, is among the most important things written by a British person in the 20th century. It set thinking Britain alight. It convinced a generation of liberal politicians they needed to deliver welfare and social reform, which is perhaps why we've never had a successful revolutionary movement in this country. So Seabohm Rowntree didn't only trump Galton, he trumped the Communist Manifesto as well.
But it wasn't all pubs and poverty for the Edwardian poor.
any old iron, any old iron. You look neat, talk about the street. You look a dapper from your nepper to your feet.
At just this moment, a raucous form of working-class entertainment was forcing its way into the heart of Britain's cities.
Old iron.
It's hard to imagine the sights and sounds and smells of the old music hall. The stench of unwashed bodies and dirty clothes, the air thick with tobacco smoke from the pipes and the cigars that all the men would be smoking. A lot of the audience would be drinking quite heavily and eating during the act, so the performers had only a few seconds to grab the attention of the audience. And for those who failed, every town had a different tradition. At Glasgow and Newcastle, for instance, they threw steel rivets. In the East End of London, it was vegetables and trotter bones. You'd get dead cats and even dead dogs flying onto the stage, so you kind of paid to hold a note and tell a good joke.
But Britain had talent. Music hall was the popular telly of its day. Its songs, the chart toppers, its acts, the pop stars. And the biggest star of all was Marr Lloyd.
I never was the one to go and stint myself. If I liked the thing, I liked it, and that's enough. But there's lots of people say...
Born in poverty in London's East End, Marr Lloyd was loved for her working-class cheek and wit. Her act was mostly sentimental songs, but her bawdy delivery was her trademark.
When the London County Council launched a major investigation into smut in the Variety Theatre, Marr Lloyd was summoned to explain herself. And she stood in front of the committee and sang 3 of her most notorious songs, but with a completely straight, butter wouldn't melt innocence that had them totally confused, didn't see anything wrong there at all. And then she chose a song their daughters would have known. Tennyson's Come Into the Garden Moored, about as proper as you could get, but she sung it with such filthy suggestiveness that they were soon pink and squirming with embarrassment. And it said she just looked them in the eye and laughed and walked off.
Come into the garden moored, for the blackbird night has flown.
But this rip-roaring, working-class entertainment was now finding a new upmarket audience. Lavish new music halls were being built all over Britain. And on Christmas Eve, 1904, the grandest music hall of all was opened. This was the most magnificent theatre in London, complete with restaurants, writing rooms, lounges, free telephones, and the first lifts to appear in any European theatre. A train ran from the lobby to the royal box, and an electric globe topped the building, spinning in the night sky. The Colosseum was the brainchild of a showman called Oswald Stoll, who'd been managing music halls from the age of 14. From humble beginnings in Liverpool, Stoll had built up a music hall empire. The Colosseum was his crowning glory.
Oswald Stoll was a shrewd businessman who wanted the middle classes to visit the Colosseum without fear of offence. So he decided to tame music hall, censoring the songs and the patter of the performers before they got on stage. He put up signs in the Colosseum dressing room saying, "Please do not use any strong language here." One disgruntled artiste said to him, "Mr. Stoll, you shouldn't be manager of a music hall. You should be a bishop."
Stuffy old Stoll was invited to stage the first ever Royal Command performance. This would be his finest hour. Stoll flooded the auditorium with 3 million roses, and a flock of royals, aristocrats and starchy hangers-on descended on the theatre for the social event of the season, the performance of the century.
And yet, when it came to it, the whole evening was curiously flat. Something to do, perhaps, with the non-appearance of the only real superstar of music hall, Murray Lloyd. Stoll had decided that she was a bit vulgar for monarchy, and he'd kept her off the bill. Murray Lloyd was livid. Did she get her revenge, ladies and gentlemen? She got her revenge. She hired another theatre just down the road and filled it all for herself, and belted out and sashayed her way through one hit after another until the audience was roaring and stomping for more. And on the placards outside her theatre, it read, "Every performance by Murray Lloyd is a command performance, by order of the British public." Now, that was the spirit of music.
All over Britain, salty little waves of democracy were beginning to wash around the old order. But the aristocracy carried on regardless at its most expansively self-indulgent. At the centre of the party was the most decadent monarch of the 20th century, Edward VII, a sleepy-eyed, avocado-shaped man known as Bertie. His mother had believed in a life of duty and propriety. Edward was more interested in indulgence of all kinds.
For the king and his court, the Edwardian menu involved an astonishing amount of food. Breakfast, a light meal. Bacon, eggs, sausage, kippers, kedgeree, porridge. And then for Edward, lobster salad or a cold chicken would be a mere snack to prepare him for lunch. Never fewer than 8 courses. Welcome respite then until tea. Cold meat, sandwiches, macaroons, scones, cakes of all kinds. A welcome respite then before the main event, dinner. Even without any guests, the court would expect 12 courses before a final manful waddle to supper. Cold meat, sandwiches, more cakes and cheese, and another day of remarkable achievement.
Despite their excesses, royalty and the aristocracy were still treated with automatic deference and respect. And the power of heredity still ruled in government. When Robert, Lord Salisbury, retired as Prime Minister in 1902, his fellow aristocrats in government selected his nephew, Arthur Balfour, as the new leader of the Tory party and Prime Minister.
Even then, there was serious muttering about an act of such gross patronage. It's said that's where we get the phrase, "Bob's your uncle" from. And certainly Arthur Balfour wasn't an obvious national leader. He was known for his high intellect, his delicate appearance, his love of velvet and blue china. From university days, he'd been nicknamed Miss Balfour, Tiger Lily, or Pretty Fanny. And there were plenty who thought him simply too delicate for the hurly-burly of imperial politics. This was the great age of country house politics. There were a grand total of 2 working-class MPs in the House of Commons, and Arthur Balfour is said to have remarked once that he had no idea what a trade union actually was. probably a joke, but by then, no longer a very funny one.
At the turn of the century, trade unions weren't a significant political force. Industrial unrest was rare, but in the summer of 1900, events in South Wales were about to change this.
In the second week of August, a signalman by the name of John Ewington, who worked for the Taff Vale Railway Company, was told that he was going to be moved away from his village of Abercynon to a district 16 miles away. Now, he had a sick wife and 10 children, and he didn't want to go. But when he protested, he was told that this was really a punishment for his repeated requests for higher pay. Now, this is one man's story, nothing much, but just sometimes a pebble can begin an avalanche.
The union retaliated by calling an all-out strike. Train services in South Wales came to a standstill. Coal was left in heaps at the pit heads. The strike entered its second week. 16,000 miners were laid off.
Now, the railway's general manager, Ammon Beasley, was a rabid anti-trade unionist, and he brought in blackleg, outside labour, to keep the line running. So, how did the strikers respond? Sabotage. They greased the railway lines so that when the carriages came along, the wheels started to spin and the trains stopped. And at that point, the strikers leapt out from these bushes and uncoupled the carriages. This was extremely irresponsible and dangerous, and it worked brilliantly. Beasley decided that he was going to discuss wages after all, and the strike was called off.
But the battle was far from over. Beasley took the Railway Workers' Union to court, where the judge ruled that the union was accountable for the strike and should pay all damages and costs, £23,000 over £2 million today. Overnight, the unions were crippled. Striking was now financially impossible.
The Taff Vale ruling would transform the trade union movement and British politics. The union leaders began to realise that if they wanted to change the law, if they wanted to protect themselves, they had to get their people inside the aristocrat barnacled club called Parliament. They needed MPs. Didn't happen overnight, but slowly, awkwardly, in ill-fitting suits, sometimes even in cloth caps, former railwaymen, former miners, boilermakers, and lowly clerks would start to win their place in the great Gothic palace of Westminster. Funny the place is, a small local railway can take you.
But for now, the biggest challenge facing Imperial Britain wasn't coming from the socialists, but from the growing industrial competition from Germany and the United States. Now Joe Chamberlain, the great imperialist, had found a new magic potion to build a stronger, greater British Empire for the new century. He returned to his old stomping ground to make the speech of his life.
On May the 15th, 1903, Joseph Chamberlain stood on this platform in Birmingham Town Hall and fired the first shot in an extraordinary guerrilla campaign to change the course of British politics. Everything the government thought was important would be swept to one side, he announced, for one issue. It was about the future of the British Empire. It was about where we stood in the world. It was about who would do well and who would go hungry. It had a very boring name, tariff reform, but it would tear this country in two.
Victorian Britain had been built on international free trade. It was almost a national religion. But now, both Germany and America were using import taxes or tariffs as a defensive wall to protect their increasingly mighty markets from British competition.
Chamberlain's response was beautifully simple. We should throw a similar wall around the British Empire. We'd tax all foreign manufactures and food coming from outside, free trade inside. British industry would supply British colonies, the British colonies would feed the British people, and the clincher, the taxes on the foreign stuff would be spent at home on old age pensions. Everybody wins. Brilliant, except for this. Chamberlain's wall of taxes would have meant British industry becoming flabbier, less competitive compared to the Germans and the Americans. At the start of a new century, Britain would have been turning her back, flinching from the rest of the world. And most important, those taxes on foreign goods would make food at home more expensive, particularly harsh on the urban poor. Very soon, Chamberlain's critics were calling his tariffs stomach taxes.
All the members sat once in the House of Parliament. On free trade and protection they were having an argument. Oh, what an argument.
Chamberlain had already torn the Liberal Party apart, and now he was working his dark magic on the Tories. A podgy young Conservative MP called Winston Churchill was so appalled by Chamberlain's protectionist campaign that he crossed the floor of the House of Commons himself and joined the Liberals. Scenting blood, the Liberal Shadow Chancellor, Henry Herbert Asquith, went on the attack. Free trade or fortress empire? The argument raged for 3 whole years on platforms, in Parliament and on music hall stages.
Protect what you require, but let's have free trade among the girls.
Every week, millions followed the twists and turns of Joe's campaign by picking up copies of a recent invention. Newspapers people actually wanted to read. Literacy had been on the rise in England and Wales ever since the Victorian education reforms. The Scots were able to read already, of course. The result was a revolution on Fleet Street. And the man leading the way was one of the new men of the more democratic 20th century. His name was Alfred Harmsworth.
Alfred Harmsworth knew what poverty meant. At times when he was young, his mother had to keep him warm by wrapping him in newspapers. And the family next door went bankrupt, and all of them killed themselves. But Alfred grew up to be a golden-haired, strikingly handsome young man, almost unable to contain his energy and ambition. He was one of those determined not to know his place.
Harmsworth had an uncanny instinct for what the man and woman in the street was interested in. Did they really want tens of thousands of words of parliamentary reports. Long letters from bishops. Boring reporting with no pictures. No, they wanted sensation, gossip, laughter.
Among the phrases coined by Harmsworth is tabloid newspaper. He also said, when a dog bites a man, it isn't news. When man bites dog, it is. And he told his journalists, the three things which are always news things are health things, sex things, and money things, which, broadly speaking, remains true.
Harmsworth built up a powerful publishing empire crowned by the Daily Mail.
For the Edwardians, the Daily Mail was a really big new thing. All the old ways of journalism, endless reporting of dull speeches, junked. In its place, first person, I was there, reporting short, dramatic stories. Big and early use of pictures, and above all, controversy. Get people angry, get them talking, get them stirred up today, and they'll be back for more tomorrow.
Harmsworth followed the Mail with the Mirror, and in 1907 bought the Times. By then, he was known as the Napoleon of Fleet Street.
Alfred Harmsworth represented a new force in Britain. Crude, unpredictable, but brimming with energy. H.G. Wells accused him of plastering the nation with rubbish. And Lord Salisbury huffily dismissed the Daily Mail as a paper by office boys for office boys, but they were both completely missing the point. Harmsworth's readers were the rising force in Britain. Dismiss them at your peril. This was the voice of Britain's new democracy.
But not all the change makers were targeting the masses. In March 1904, two men were about to bring new flash and swagger onto the roads of Britain. They were an odd couple. One, the wealthy son and heir of a titled landowner and a speed freak. The other, a self-made man. He'd left school at 9 and was now the proud owner of a tiny electrical engineering works in Manchester. Their names were Charles Rolls and Henry Royce. Unimpressed by foreign cars, Royce had taken one to pieces and rebuilt it from top to bottom, creating a vastly improved new model.
When Charles Rolls heard about the new car, he was instantly intrigued. Perhaps Mr. Royce might care to join him in London. No go. Mr. Royce was far too busy. He wasn't budging. And so Rolls, the aristocrat, had to get in the train and come north to Manchester to meet Royce, the self-made working-class engineer. And that's part of the point. Power was shifting. Rolls had to go to see Royce, not Royce to Rolls. At any rate, they met for lunch here in the dining room of the city's newly built Midland Hotel, and perhaps surprisingly, the meal was a great success. And after it, they went for a spin in Royce's new car. And when he got back home to London, Rolls dragged his business partner out of bed and told him, "I've just met the greatest motor engineer in the world." Rolls Royce was born.
Before Rolls-Royce, cars were derided as entirely unreliable foreign toys.
I was great at 9 o'clock today. My husband came in a lovely way. We closed down in Brighton for a month each day, so we travelled on a motor car. Our
They were noisy, dirty, clunking machines.
Knocked down a policeman with a snow. I was trying to follow and you clipped the lead. It was lovely on the motor car. But going
Charles Rolls' marketing skills, combined with Henry Royce's engineering genius, would change this.
but could not break the car. All through riding on a motor car.
But what really made Rolls Royce's reputation was this glittering cracker. This is not a Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. This is the Rolls Royce Silver Ghost. Unique. It's one of the most valuable cars on the planet, worth at least £25 million. But in 1907, what flabbergasted even the most hardened car fanatics was its performance. Fast, powerful, reliable, and remarkably quiet. Not one of the best in the world.
Charles Rolls was soon moving on to conquer the next speed frontier, flight. He was eager to leave the road behind. No dust, police traps or taxis, he explained. He became a national hero when he completed the first 90-minute flight to France and back. Then on July the 12th, 1910, Rolls came to Bournemouth to take part in an air show.
It was a gusty day, bad weather for flying something made out of canvas and sticks. A French pilot had already been up and crashed, but he was unhurt. And he came up to Rolls and said, "Look, don't do this." Rolls, celebrity daredevil, ignored him, took off, made a perfect circuit of the airfield, and then came in to land at a spot just opposite the judge's tent. People watching thought he was coming in a bit too fast. Then there was a sickening crack. Part of the aircraft fell off, followed by the rest of the aircraft and the Honourable Charles Rolls.
Rolls was killed instantly. The first British casualty of the new age of flight. The photographer rushed forward to get a picture, but he was set upon and his camera smashed.
And so ended one of the most successful marriages between marketing and industry in our history. Had aristocratic flair and elan worked a little more often hand in hand with northern engineering grit and genius, then our industrial history would have been a great deal more successful.
In the north of England, another challenge to the old order was gaining momentum. In October 1903, a small group of women met in this terraced house in the centre of Manchester, the home of the widow and political activist Emmeline Pankhurst and her three daughters, Christabel, Sylvia and Adela.
And at that meeting, in this parlour, they set up the Women's Social and Political Union. Now, this was an age of do-goodery and busybodies. Organisations of all kinds politely, deferentially lobbying politicians for reforms, including votes for women. But the WSPU was going to be very different. Little did the women gathered here know that before long, one of them wouldn't be sitting in the parlour, but in a prison cell.
In 1903, more women than ever before were in work, but the limits were suffocating. There were only 6 women architects, 3 vets, 2 accountants. Women were allowed to study, but at Oxford and Cambridge, they weren't allowed to graduate. And women still weren't allowed to vote.
On the morning of the 13th of October 1905, Christabel Pankhurst was still respectable. She was a well-dressed, middle-class law student.
but she was on her way to break just about every taboo she could think of. She was walking along here with her new friend, Annie Kenney, a working-class mill girl known as the Blue-Eyed Beggar. But what they were planning was truly shocking, because they were on their way to a huge political meeting at Manchester's Free Trade Hall, and they were determined, at all costs, to be arrested. The meeting was a Liberal rally, attended by the MPs Sir Edward Grey and Winston Churchill. Christabel and Annie jumped up onto their seats and yelled, "Will the Liberals give women the vote?" They refused to answer, so the women unfurled a banner emblazoned with the words, "Votes for Women." Some people in the hall told them to shut up. Others cried, "Let the women speak."
The police ordered them to act like ladies. In response, Christabel spat at the policemen and started to hit them. Exasperated, the police bundled both of them outside onto the street. It was proving a little harder to get arrested than Christabel had imagined. So again, she spat at the officers and hit them. And this time, they were arrested. "Never mind," said Annie Kenney, "we've got what we wanted." "Yes," said Christabel, "I wanted to assault a policeman." They were convicted and offered the choice of prison or a fine, and they chose prison.
Shout, shout, out with your song, cry with the wind, for the dawn is breaking.
Annie Kenney went to Manchester's Strangeways prison for 3 days. Christabel Pankhurst for 6. And their short imprisonment was an inspiration to women all over Britain.
When Annie and Christabel emerged from Strangeways, there was a great crowd cheering them. And then, on the 19th of October, thousands of people went back to the scene of the crime, the Free Trade Hall, to welcome the women on their return from prison. Here in Manchester, the suffragette movement had taken a decisive step, and there would be no going back.
But at the end of 1905, Joe Chamberlain was still making the political weather, still dominating the headlines. For 2.5 years, he'd been campaigning for a fortress empire defended by protectionist tariffs. In the process, he'd split his own party, the Conservatives, in two. The Prime Minister, poor pretty Fanny, sat uneasily on the fence while his government descended into civil war, and the free trade liberals were winning ground. Because Britain was never going to accept a policy that would increase the price of food.
Quite simply, Joe Chamberlain, the man who'd offered the British an alternative 20th century, had lost the argument. But he was going to draw blood and bring the Prime Minister down with him, and publicly he attacked Arthur Balfour as the lamest man ever to govern the march of an army. Last straw. In December 1905, Balfour called a general election. For one thing was certain, the Liberals couldn't win it. Could they not?
Balfour couldn't have been more wrong. The Liberals successfully positioned themselves as the party of the people. They campaigned on a manifesto of social welfare, free trade and reform, and they won a landslide victory. The Tories were annihilated. Even Arthur Balfour lost his seat.
What a smash! Declared Chamberlain, who seemed rather chuffed that he'd now managed to destroy 2 political parties in the course of his extraordinary career. But his political failure over tariff reform was soon followed by personal disaster. 6 months after the general election, Chamberlain failed to turn up
for a dinner appointment, and his wife found him lying helpless on the bathroom floor, struck down by a devastating stroke. Joe Chamberlain never fully regained his extraordinary powers of speech, but through a miraculous effort of iron Victorian will, he did return to the Commons benches. And the man who'd set out to transform Britain in so many different ways now found Parliament radically changed. And more change, much greater change, was on the way. 29 new MPs dedicated to defending the interests of the working class were now sitting in Parliament. They'd soon take on a new name, the Labour Party.
That 1906 election was a big blow for country house government. A new generation was coming in. Asquith, Lloyd George, Winston Churchill. And as for Joe Chamberlain, who'd done so much to shake the old order, he was condemned to a pitiful parliamentary afterlife, left lolling, voiceless on the benches he had once commanded. The last great Victorian radical could only watch as the young century's first great age of reform flared into life all around him. A new dawn, was it not?
In the next programme, a German invasion. Magnificent men, fighting women, and Charlie Chaplin. March 1906. German uniforms in central London. The unsmiling men begin to disperse among the early morning shoppers. They'd arrived to bring fear to the very heart of Britannia's imperial capital. They were now goose-stepping down Oxford Street.
No, this was not a real invasion, of course, which has been unaccountably missed out by the history books, but nor is it entirely television fantasy. It did happen, but it was a publicity stunt for the Daily Mail, who were serialising the latest thriller to shock the Edwardian British, the invasion of 1910.
The German military threat was real enough, and Britain was being drawn into a ruinously expensive arms race. But a Liberal government had just been elected by a landslide, promising a welfare revolution. And Britain couldn't afford both.
So which was it to be? Battleships or pensions? The underpinnings of warfare or of welfare? We are about to enter one of the most dangerous and exhilarating periods in the history of British politics, and our stage is set for a showdown.
The Edwardian era is often remembered as a romantic, golden age. A long, hot summer of big hats, cottage gardens, and messing about on the river. A time of simple pleasures, country house parties with picnics on the lawn. A lost Eden of innocence and imagination immortalized in classic children's stories. The Railway Children, The Wind in the Willows, and Peter Pan.
Now, it may be partly because of those children's stories, but Edwardian Britain has been covered by a golden, dappled glow, despite the facts, which are that this was a country tearing itself apart politically, economic and socially. Millions of real Edwardian children were barefoot and living on diets worse than the Middle Ages. The glitter was real. Fun was being had. But almost everywhere you look in Edwardian Britain, dark, angry storm clouds were brewing.
On the 15th of July 1906, a young woman called Adela Pankhurst made her way to a park in Manchester called Boggart Hole Clough. She'd just been released from prison for heckling a local MP, Winston Churchill, at a public meeting. She was here to make a speech about that most basic right, the right to vote. Adela Pankhurst and her fellow speakers were standing here at the bottom of the hillside. A massive crowd spread out around them in all directions. As the meeting began, a group of thugs began mingling with the Pankhurst supporters. One of the speakers asked what the Tory cave dwellers and the medieval liberals were going to do about women's suffrage.
The answer was a terrifying northern roar, and down the hill poured the men, many of them carrying sticks and coming straight for Adela. People in the crowd began to scream and panic. The men went straight for the women, grabbed them, and brutally hauled them back up the hill, passing them from man to man. Their clothes were half torn off. They were beaten around the face until the blood flowed, and older men, respectable-looking men, started to shout obscene suggestions. The mood of the crowd turned until they were roaring like savages. What happened here one long ago Edwardian Sunday was only the very beginning, because the battle for democracy, women's votes, would prove to be extraordinarily violent.
And this was only one of the increasingly violent arguments about poverty, privilege and liberty that provided the soundtrack for Edwardian Britain. But calming, progressive help was at hand. In January 1906, the Liberals were swept into power, promising to tackle inequality and reform politics. Their policies were exciting. Their Prime Minister wasn't. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman had a radical streak, but looked and sounded like an elderly sea lion.
Sir Henry once declared, "Personally, I am a great believer in bed, in constantly keeping horizontal. The heart and everything else goes slower, and the whole system is refreshed." Now, Sir Henry wasn't a well man, as well as being rather an idle one. Never mind, he did lead the Liberals to their greatest ever election victory, a new dawn after 10 years of Tory rule.
And the new Liberal government contained 3 of modern Britain's great future Prime Ministers. Herbert Asquith was ridiculously clever, a self-made statesman whose sternly sober face hid a wildly romantic heart. Cartoonists called him the last of the Romans. Alongside him was Lloyd George, a charismatic Welsh radical and his unlikely admirer, a young aristocrat and former Tory MP, Winston Churchill. Three musketeers. They were ready to slash through the complacency of Westminster. But just at that moment, Campbell Bannerman's clever lying down in bed cure failed him. In April 1908, he became the first and only Prime Minister to die in Downing Street. Asquith took over.
Now the reforms would really begin. A little later, alarmed by his exuberant drinking habits, colleagues would refer to the Prime Minister as Old Squiffy. But in 1908, Herbert Asquith was reshaping the administration into the greatest Liberal government of modern times.
The Liberals came to power in an age of technological change. Careering motor cars, the telephone craze, talk of hydroelectric energy and wave power, and above all, the flying machine. A Frenchman, Louis Blériot, was the first man to fly across the Channel in July 1909. Britain wasn't quite an island anymore. Within 24 hours, his plane was on display at Selfridges in London, and a motorcar salesman called Claude Graham White was one of the thousands of visitors who came to gape. Well, Claude was hooked, and within 6 weeks he'd been over to France, helped to build his own aircraft, and then when it was trundled out of the factory, no instruction, no training, he'd flown it successfully for at least 20 minutes, which meant that he was officially a magnificent man in a flying machine. The Daily Mail, always ready for a sharp stunt, offered a prize of £10,000, huge money, more than £750,000 today, to the first pilot to fly the 195 miles from London to Manchester, and the race of the year was filmed. Two men came forward, another Frenchman, Louis Poulon, and our Claude.
Things didn't start well for Claude. He went for an afternoon nap to prepare himself for the race the following day. Meanwhile, Poulon, not even waiting for a test flight, had set off. By the time Graham White was woken up, he was already an hour behind, and he decided on a desperate measure. He would fly through the night. Now, he had no lights, no altimeter, no fuel gauge, no compass. This was enormously dangerous. He relied on the headlamps of friends' cars on the roads below. By 4 in the morning, his engine had failed and he had to put down. A huge crowd gathered and he was off again. Next time, he was forced down by winds to hear the dreadful news that it was too late. Poulon had already arrived in Manchester and claimed the prize, thanks to such dastardly tactics as not having a sleep before he started.
Meanwhile, swathes of deepest England were also sleeping. Compton Verney, near Stratford-upon-Avon in Warwickshire, the traditional seat of the Willoughby de Brookes. Here, for centuries, there was hierarchy and order, fox hunting and forelock tugging, and it would go on like this forever. Or would it? Soon after the Liberal landslide, a a quizzical, long-faced aristocrat, the 19th Lord Willoughby de Brooke was clip-clopping around his estate, reflecting on the joys of fox hunting.
That morning, Willoughby de Brooke met an old farmer who told him that after the Liberal victory, nothing would be the same again. Everything that you have will be taken away from you and divided amongst the people. I didn't believe a single word of it, said the 19th Lord later. I carried on hunting as if nothing was going to happen. For Willoughby and his kind, the modern world was a most unpleasant rumour. But they were all about to get the shock of their titled little lives.
From the day the Liberals came to power, a small army of gloriously old-fashioned Tory peers had been vetoing almost every attempt at reform. And in 1909, Asquith's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George, was about to ignite one of the greatest political battles of the age, whose result shapes our politics even now.
David Lloyd George was the most radical chancellor this country had ever known. He was pledged to bring Britain into a new age of welfare, when wretchedness and human degradation will be as remote to the people of this country as the wolves which once infested its forests. But to the rich, Lloyd George himself was a great deal more dangerous than any wolf.
In 1909, recession was looming, unemployment was rising, and with no state pensions or national insurance, Britain was still tormented by Victorian levels of poverty, sickness, and hunger. Lloyd George wanted to pay for welfare reforms by making massive cuts in defence spending. But with fears of a German invasion being stoked by the popular press, he had little room for manoeuvre.
Out on the street, patriotic crowds were chanting for the latest awesome war machine, the British-built Dreadnought battleship. We want 8 and we won't wait. Lloyd George's problem was that dreadnoughts were ruinously expensive. To pay both for them and for welfare, he devised what he called his people's budget. He said it was a war budget to wage implacable warfare against poverty and squalidness.
To pay for both dreadnoughts and welfare, Lloyd George announced an increase in estate duties, a huge blow to the wealthy. And he also introduced a new super tax for the super rich. The People's Budget was a direct hit on landowners in the Lords, many of them in Lloyd George's own party, and they still had huge power over the elected Commons.
Lord Rosebery, an immensely wealthy landowner who'd also been Liberal Prime Minister, described the People's Budget as pure socialism, the negation of faith, of family, of property, of monarchy, of empire. In fact, he said, it wasn't really a budget at all. It was a revolution. And around Britain, the wealthy began the most ferocious campaign. In the newspapers, in the city, among landowners, and in the House of Lords. They even formed the Anti-Budget League. And so, on the evening of July the 30th, 1909, Lloyd George decided he had no choice but to take his people's budget directly to the people.
That night, 4,000 men crammed themselves into a former pub called the Edinburgh Castle in the East End of London. The Chancellor of the Exchequer stood up to raucous applause. Many who heard Lloyd George in his prime said he was the greatest orator British politics ever produced, and this was to be the speech of his life.
Was it not a shame that a rich country like Britain
should allow people who had toiled all their lives to die in penury and starvation. His people's budget, he said, was being opposed by shabby rich men. He needed the money for dreadnoughts, he reminded the audience, and the workmen put in their coppers. But when he went round wealthy Belgravia, there arose such a howl. Well, I tell you, the day of their reckoning is at hand.
This was bare-knuckle class warfare. Rumours were already spreading that some landowners were threatening to sack their servants if the people's budget was passed.
Lloyd George was merciless. Are they going to threaten to devastate rural England by feeding and dressing themselves? He asked. A typical nobleman needs one man to fix his collar and adjust his tie in the morning, a couple of men to carry a boiled egg to him for his breakfast, a fourth man to open the door for him, a fifth man to help him in and out of his carriage, a sixth and a seventh to drive him. Why, a fully equipped duke costs as much to keep up as 2 dreadnoughts. To his fervent admirers, Lloyd George was the Welsh wizard. He was the Merlin of radical politics. And on that night, he blew on the fire with all his magic dragon might and brought the trouble to boiling point.
This was an age of public meetings and mass hysteria, live politics and live theatre. While Lloyd George was wowing them at the Edinburgh Castle, another rising star was doing the same in the West End. Music, or vaudeville, mattered in 1909. Films didn't. They were mostly novelties and curiosities. Like the aristocrats, music hall stars would surely be around forever. Not quite. One young Londoner would become the symbol of this next revolution. Charlie Chaplin grew up in Lambeth, South London, and his early life was as grim as anything you'll find in the novels of Dickens. His father deserted the family before drinking himself to an early grave.
The Chaplins ran out of money and food, and they touched bottom here at the Lambeth Workhouse, a place built to be scary, designed to be humiliating. Desperately trying to help out the family finances, Chaplin tramped all over Britain as a child performer. He had a go at singing, clog dancing, and a disastrous attempt at stand-up comedy before settling on slickly timed, gag-filled comedy sketches. In early 1908, he had his big break, a contract with the Fred Karno Company. Karno had been a famous acrobat and clown, credited with the invention of the custard pie in the face gag. Now he was head of the greatest comedy troupe in Britain, if not the world.
Fred Karno's headquarters here in Camberwell in South London was known as the Fun Factory. It really was a kind of factory. He drove his performers very hard with frantic rehearsal schedules. And if he didn't like an act, he'd stand in the wings and blow raspberries at his own actors. Whenever he was asked, "Who's your star turn?" he'd reply, "My name's up there, and that's enough." Mr. Karno, and who's heard of him nowadays, had a cuckoo in the nest. In February 1908, Charlie Chaplin topped the Karno bill for the first time. In the same year, a young comic called Arthur Stanley Jefferson joined the company. He's better known now as Stan Laurel. So for a couple of years, 2 of the greatest comic geniuses of cinema shared shabby digs and performed together all over Britain and the United States. In 1912, Chaplin was spotted by the emerging American film industry and offered a contract with the Keystone Company in Los Angeles. Chaplin had seen some of the Keystone films and he wasn't much impressed. He described them as crude, rough and tumble. But he took the money, it was a lot, and said ta-ra to the Carno troupe. Stan Laurel thought he was making a great mistake. We all wished him well from the bottom of our hearts, he said later, while secretly congratulating ourselves on possessing a superior wisdom. Even Chaplin didn't really get the movies. A year in that racket, he said, and I could return to vaudeville, an international star.
In his first movie, Making a Living, Chaplin played a hapless newspaper reporter. Drawing on his Carno training, he packed every scene of the 8-minute reel with improvised gags. Later, he sat down with great excitement to watch the edited version of his first performance on screen. And it broke his heart.
Chaplin's first film performance had been butchered beyond recognition. The next day, he was told to go away and put on some comedy makeup. Anything would do. They were already haphazardly improvising the next film. On his way to the wardrobe, Chaplin said, he decided to put on some baggy pants, big shoes, a cane and a derby hat. Already gags and joke ideas were racing through his mind. And with the single addition of a small moustache, the tramp was born.
By 1912, the British were flocking to the movies in their millions, and the boy from the Lambeth workhouse would go on to become the greatest film star of the age.
Had he not taken that reckless gamble on the other side of the Atlantic, he'd have been stuck in the declining world of the music hall, and Charlie Chaplin would be a name known only to a tiny number of enthusiasts. Actually, more likely, given the streets he came from, he would have signed up early for the First World War and been killed.
Throughout 1909, British fears about German military expansion grew and grew. But 5 months after his great People's Budget speech, Lloyd George's attempt to balance defence and welfare was still being blocked by the House of Lords. In November 1909, by a huge majority, they finally kicked it out. The first time the Lords had ever rejected a budget. It was an act of suicidal stupidity. And it was Asquith's chance to clip the old buzzard's wings.
Under the British system, the Lords would only lose those powers by voting themselves, a kind of political self-slaughter. Not very likely. And so Asquith asked the king to allow the creation of 400 to 500 new liberal peers. Democracy would swamp aristocracy. Edward VII hated the idea. The man was, after all, a king-emperor. And so to try and delay things, he said to Asquith there'd have to be another special general election first. This concession did not reassure the landed aristocrats. In this chamber, behind gnarled hands where blue blood still flowed, they started to call the king himself a traitor.
1910 would be a year of political turmoil. There would be 2 general elections. The first to break the deadlock on the People's Budget. The second to decide the fate of the House of Lords. The Liberals hung on to power with the backing of 40 Labour MPs and 82 Irish nationalists. And the People's Budget was finally passed. Asquith now turned his attention to the House of Lords. his reform bill to cut away their powers of veto wouldn't mean the total abolition of the upper house.
But it did mean that the domination of the House of Commons over this place would be near absolute.
In May, worried old King Edward died. His successor, George V, was just as queasy, but he was afraid the monarchy would be the Liberals' next target. Feeling bullied and with great reluctance, he secretly gave Asquith the promise he'd been looking for. If the government won a second election in December, the king would allow the Lords to be swamped by 500 mass-manufactured Liberal peers. To the king's dismay, the Liberals won that election too.
On the 23rd of July 1911, Asquith set out for his parliamentary triumph. He had the king's promise to swamp the Lord's Chamber with Liberal peers in his pocket. On the short journey, he was cheered by crowds. But when he got into the Commons chamber, Asquith was shouted down by almost berserk Tory MPs chanting, "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" and "Who killed the king?" After 45 minutes of this, Asquith gave up and walked out.
But the last of the Romans wasn't going to crack. The Tory party itself was now at daggers drawn, with the leadership calling for surrender. 234 Tory peers eventually agreed to throw in the towel, including Lord Curzon, who'd led the campaign for the defence of aristocratic government.
Curzon said that anyone who kept fighting deserves to be sent to a lunatic asylum. Willoughby de Brooke preferred Bedlam to Curzon. "I am prepared to defend the hereditary principle," he said, "whether it be applied to peers or to foxhounds."
After a bitter debate, the vote was going to be very tight. Lord Willoughby de Brooke could see that some of his allies were wavering. Some cowardly souls were even sneaking out of the house.
In a rather desperate attempt to keep one wobbly duke in the chamber for the vote, Willoughby de Brooke stole his top hat and coat. In 1911, it would have been unthinkable for a gentleman to go outside hatless. But the noble peer bolted anyway. He scampered off into the night without his hat. And that's as good an image, perhaps, as we'll get of the final political scuttling of Britannia's aristocratic order.
The Liberals had triumphed over the Lords, but they weren't nearly radical enough for the trades unions, now aflame with anger and a sense of injustice, and nowhere more so than in the docks. The Edwardians were hugely dependent on imported food, unloaded by tens of thousands of badly paid men. At the start of a scorching August in 1911, the London dockers came out on strike. Piles of vegetables on the wharves rotted. Barrels of butter turned rancid. Fish and meat began to stink. It was getting hotter, and tempers rose. Armed police and the army prepared to break the strike. The key union leader, a flamboyant man called Ben Tillett, wrote a letter to the Home Secretary, Winston Churchill. Tillett's letter to Churchill was a blood-curdling warning. "We shall bring about a state of war. Hunger and poverty have driven the dock and ship workers to this present resort, and neither your soldiers nor police, your murder, shall avert the catastrophe that is coming to this country. In the early years of the century, most radicals and socialists had relied on the liberals. But the Russian Revolution of 1905 changed the mood. Ben Tillett and his comrades intended to take Britain down the same revolutionary road. Now they challenged the liberals directly by calling strikes all over Britain. The mood turned ugly when police intervened in a dock strike in Liverpool. Violence spread rapidly through the city. The mayor of Birkenhead warned that this was no longer a strike, a revolution was in progress. And he told the Home Office, if you cannot offer me more military or naval support, I cannot answer for the safety of life or property. Within days, the entire Aldershot garrison had been ordered north, and off the coast of Birkenhead, there were 2 warships. The strikes and violence continued to spread. It was getting hard to see how the Liberals, with so many landowners and mill owners among their MPs, could ever be the true champions of the working class. In 1912, the leader of the London Port Authority, Lord Devonport, tried to break another strike in the London docks by drafting in blackleg labour with police protection. Tillett came here to Tower Hill, to a huge open-air meeting to test the workers' resolve. In front of the now silent river and a sea of faces with his hat tipped back on his head, Tillett demanded to know how many of the striking dockers had military training and how many would serve in a workers' police. And a forest of hands went up, and his language became more inflamed. Sedition or no sedition? I want to say that if our men are murdered, I am going to take a gun and shoot Lord Devonport. And later, he called upon God to strike Lord Devonport dead. And the cry came back from the crowd, "He shall die! He shall die!" Mounting panic, army camps appeared in Hyde Park, Regent's Park, Battersea Park. It's reckoned that almost every available soldier in the country was on standby for the coming uprising. In the West End, gents left their clubs to go and buy revolvers to protect themselves from the revolution that was about to happen. For a short while, it seemed that those who predicted a British Revolution weren't so daft. All of this happened exactly between the First Russian Revolution and the Second Russian Revolution. And though in the end, this fever, with its talk of workers, police and revolvers, would be washed away in the vastly greater violence and bloodshed to come, in 1912, the old order seemed not only old, but fragile. And the same was true in private life. In 1913, a 33-year-old biologist marched into the British Museum reading room with only one thing on her mind. She'd been married for over a year to a Canadian called Reginald Gates, but she was still a virgin. Her name was Marie Stopes, and like so many women of her time, sex was a subject she knew very little about.
In true scientific spirit and showing considerable courage, Marie Stopes came here to the reading room at the British Museum to find out everything that was known about sex. And for 6 months, she read her way through every document and tract in English and French and German. Some of them so explicit, so dangerous, that they were kept locked away in a room with restricted access, known simply as the cupboard.
Mary Stopes was genuinely puzzled about what was wrong with her marriage. She'd recently fallen in love with a married man, the translator of Tolstoy, Aylmer Maude, who was lodging in her home. Reginald Gates was suspicious of their friendship, and in a jealous rage, he threatened to shoot him.
When Marie Stopes returned home each evening, her husband was waiting for her, livid and brimming with abuse and taunts. She wanted to escape to the arms of Aylmer Maude, but in those days, for an Edwardian woman, divorce was almost impossible.
Edwardian Britain wasn't a nation of universal sexual repression. Among working-class families, huge numbers of children were born out of wedlock. Among the upper classes, sexual behaviour was getting wilder. The late King Edward had led the way. Rather earlier, his notorious appetite for women had earned him the nickname Edward the Caresser. Herbert Asquith's diaries and letters reveal floods of passion for his much younger mistresses.
If Asquith was an elderly romantic and possibly a lecher, Lloyd George was a notorious goat. Lord Kitchener used to say that he objected to discussing sensitive military matters in front of the cabinet because they all went home and told their wives. Except for Lloyd George, who went home and told somebody else's wife.
But, like Marie Stopes, most people were still comparatively ignorant about sex. In the course of her research, Stopes came to the conclusion that her husband was impotent. To get a divorce, however, she'd have to prove it. In May 1914, she underwent a medical examination that certified her virginity, and the marriage was annulled. Mary Stopes wrote about her traumatic experiences of love, sex and marriage in the pioneering book Married Love. She was the first to write about sexual intercourse in a matter-of-fact way. We tend to think of women's lib as a 1970s thing, but it was also one of the growing intellectual movements of Edwardian life. Just after 6 a.m. on the 19th of February 1913, there was an explosion at Lloyd George's new house, still under construction near his golf club at Walton-on-the-Hill in Surrey.
The servants' wing was badly damaged, the ceilings ruined, doors and windows blown out. The bombs were simple canisters filled with gunpowder, and the timing device very crude, simply a lighted candle stuck on top of a paraffin-soaked rag. No note was found, but the police did discover 2 broken hat pins and, in the road outside, 1 woman's shoe. The main culprit was a gawky, rather awkward young redhead called Emily Wilding Davison. Within a few months, her name would echo round the world. But for now, responsibility was taken on behalf of the whole suffragette movement by Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst. Speaking that very night in Cardiff, she said, "We may not yet have got the whole government in prison, but we have blown up the Chancellor of the Exchequer's house." Now, some people booed, and one protester said, "Why have you blown him up?" To which Mrs. Pankhurst replied, "To wake him up." Laughter, applause, and hooting of horns.
Even radical liberals like Lloyd George still drew the line at votes for women. On both sides, the struggle became more intense. hunger strikes, forced feeding, windows smashed, paintings slashed, post boxes burned and telegraph links brought down. And sweet-looking little old ladies terrorizing the authorities by applying for gun licenses. Next target, the social event of the year, Derby Day in Epsom.
Emily Davison arrived at Epsom by railway, made her way to the racecourse, and then marked up her card, waiting for the all-important 3 o'clock race when the King's horse, Marr, would be running. The race was a flat sprint. As the horses turned into the final straight, Marr was running in third from last position. Emily Davison slipped underneath the barrier. One of the bystanders tried to grab her, but he said later that she shook herself free and cried, "I will!" And then she strode straight into the path of the King's horse.
The horse hit Emily Davison with colossal force. She fell and rolled over 2 or 3 times, then lay unconscious. Film footage shows her grabbing the reins. Some believe she was trying to pin a banner on the horse. Davison was taken to hospital. Hate mail was to follow. This being Britain, more concern was expressed for the horse, which survived. Emily Wilding Davison didn't. On the 8th of June 1913, 4 days after her protest, she died of terrible internal injuries. At the funeral, her coffin was draped in a suffragette flag. Thousands of men and women lined the streets as it passed. The coffin was flanked by women dressed in the colours of the suffrage movement. Green for hope, purple for dignity, and white for purity. These rebel women and rebel girls smashed the complacent face of Edwardian Britain and changed the image of this country around the world. No longer the stuffy, narrow, unchanging society. The suffragettes turned Emily Davison quite deliberately into an international martyr, impossible to ignore and unforgettable. What she did to herself here was horrible. But what happened to her after her death was everything she hoped for. Attacked by militant women and challenged by socialist strikes, Asquith now made another, even more dangerous enemy. For more than a generation, the Liberals had been committed to loosening Britain's grip on Ireland with a form of devolution or Home Rule. But they'd always been angrily opposed by the Protestant majority in Ulster. In April 1912, Asquith tried again. Under the leadership of the lawyer and QC Sir Edward Carson, the Ulster Unionists started organising fellow Protestants, and the Tories were with him.
at a vast meeting here in Belfast. Edward Carson challenged the crowd to raise their hands and declare that never, under any circumstances, will we submit to Home Rule. Even the leader of the Conservative Party, standing beside Carson, raised his hand as well. And then they set out to get the entire Unionist population of Northern Ireland to sign an oath of resistance. Not just with speeches and pens, but if necessary, bullets and bayonets too. This oath was called the Ulster Covenant, and in the end, nearly 500,000 people signed it, including a man called Fred Crawford, who, to show his dedication to the cause, signed in his own blood. In January 1913, the Unionists formed the Ulster Volunteer Force to defend the northern counties of Ireland against British attempts to enforce Home Rule. Some 100,000 men joined up, armed with half a dozen machine guns and 50,000 rifles, mainly smuggled from Germany. This wasn't just about Ireland. All across Britain, huge sums of money were being raised for the Unionist cause. In Liverpool shipyards and Hammersmith pubs, working men were secretly stockpiling massive quantities of arms. Lorries were jolting across the roads of England and Scotland with secret cargoes of guns and ammunition. Young men were slipping quietly away from their homes to go across the water and fight for Ulster. Because for many people, the loss of Britain's first colony would be the beginning of the end for that great imperial power, Britannia.
On the 20th of March 1914, British troops based near Dublin were ordered to prepare to move north to Ulster. The commander of British forces in Ireland, Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Paget, was worried by the orders because many of his men were from Protestant Unionist families.
Paget sent an urgent secret telegram to the War Office. All but 2 officers resigning their commissions today. Fear men will refuse to move. From London, silence. Paget sent another telegram. Brigadier and 57 officers prefer to accept dismissal if ordered north. For a large swathe of the British Army in Ireland, this was close to outright mutiny.
The government sent a battle fleet to the Ulster coast. If it comes to rebellion and civil war, Winston Churchill said, the government will fight to win it. In the end, the rebellion was stopped dead in its tracks, not by troops, not by battleships, but by the Great War. Within weeks, the men of the Ulster Volunteer Force would be reorganized into the 36th Ulster Division, and their action in battle would be so heroic, the scale of their slaughter so overwhelming, that the idea of betraying their memory by imposing a single united Ireland disappeared from most British minds. On June the 28th, 1914, 1,500 miles away in Sarajevo, a single shot rang round the world. A Serbian nationalist had assassinated the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the starting pistol for Armageddon. The Austro-Hungarians declared war on the Serbs. The pro-Serb Russians declared war on them. And suddenly, half Europe was mobilizing.
Churchill wrote to his wife Clementine, "Everything tends towards catastrophe and collapse. I
interested, geared up and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? The preparations have a hideous fascination for me. Right to the end, Herbert Asquith was working through the night to preserve peace. After midnight on the 1st of August, he drove to Buckingham Palace. Asquith said, "The poor king was hauled out of his bed to appeal to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, to stop the Russian mobilization. King George appeared in a brown dressing gown over his nightshirt and with copious signs of having been aroused from his beauty sleep. He topped the diplomatic letter, 'My dear Nicky,' and signed it, 'Georgie.' But Russian mobilization continued. Later that day, Germany declared war on Russia. Asquith called an emergency cabinet meeting. He'd been told that 3/4 of his own MPs were against intervention in Europe. Churchill stood firm, but his great friend and ally Lloyd George was threatening to resign from the government rather than vote for war. Lloyd George and Churchill spent a lot of the meeting scribbling hasty notes and throwing them across the table at each other. After it was over, Lloyd George tore most of them up, but his mistress and secretary, Frances Stevenson, gathered together the pieces and she kept them. And what they show is Churchill exerting all his eloquence and cajoling charm to win his ally round. "I am deeply attached to you and have followed your instinct and guidance for nearly 10 years. And again, pray God, it is our whole future, comrades or opponents. And again, all the rest of our lives, we shall be opposed." Lloyd George's replies are much terser, almost coquettish in their brevity, and fewer, but they do show that he was coming round. Like most radical liberals, Lloyd George had always been a patriotic imperialist. In the end, he believed that the two democracies, Britain and France, would have to stand together. Awful, but necessary. On the street, it all seemed simpler. Time to teach the Hun a lesson. The Daily Mail's old goose-stepping Germans would turn out to be the ghosts from a terrible future. An anti-war demonstration in Trafalgar Square on Sunday, August the 2nd, was a damp squib. Very late the following night, Asquith heard a roaring sound half a mile away. It was the crowd cheering the king, and he found himself disgusted. He wrote to his lover, Venetia Stanley. "War, or anything that seems likely to lead to war, is always popular with the London mob." On the 3rd of August, at 6:45 in the evening, Germany declared war on France. German troops were gathering on the Belgian border. The Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, informed the German ambassador that if Germany invaded Belgium, Britain would go to war. Armed guards suddenly appeared at British railway junctions and ports. Britannia's home fleet, lights doused, slipped down the channel to take up battle stations in the North Sea. The British ambassador in Berlin packed his bags and hurried home. At dusk, on the 3rd of August, Edward Grey was standing by a window in his room at the Foreign Office, looking down at the lamplighters going about their business. And he said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime."
At 11 p.m. on the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and in doing so, committed herself to the greatest bloodletting the world had ever seen.
In the next programme, anti-German riots, trench warfare, the first Blitz, and the dictatorship of David Lloyd George. A November morning in the churned battlefields of Flanders and northern France. 4 British platoons are making their way through the mud. Each stops at a mass grave and digs up one body. At midnight, a British general is blindfolded. Three days later, on the 11th of November 1920, the chosen coffin was carried in full military procession through the streets of London. In a solemn ceremony, the body was then buried deep in the sand below Westminster Abbey.
The tomb of the unknown warrior is a supremely democratic memorial. Millions of bereaved people could half believe that the person buried here was their own father, husband, son, brother, or friend. At the time, some people thought it was too democratic, almost a bit common. But the so-called Great War touched people in these islands in a way that no conflict, really since the brutal civil wars of the 17th century, had done. First, of course, the millions who actually fought, but also the millions at home who felt the full force of modern warfare for the first time. Bereaved, bombed, uprooted or bankrupted. Now, we know that the war to end all wars didn't, but it tore up Europe and it changed the great story of the British people forever.
Sunday, the 23rd of August, 1914, was a nerve-wracking day for Britain. In Belgium, British troops had just faced the Germans in battle for the first time. But the Prime Minister was distracted, as he often was. Henry Herbert Asquith was enjoying a weekend in the country, here at Lymm Castle on the Kent coast. The 61-year-old Premier was busy writing, not to his generals, but to a 27-year-old woman called Venetia Stanley.
Asquith wrote to Venetia Stanley most days, sometimes several times a day, and often right in the middle of crucial cabinet meetings. With his lengthy love letters and his leisurely country house weekends, Asquith himself was beginning to look as dated as the posh politics of Edwardian Britain. After one of those weekends, a hostess asked him, "Mr. Asquith, do you take an interest in the war?" Asquith thought she was joking, but soon it was a question on many people's lips.
Two men in Asquith's cabinet were taking a ferocious interest in the war. The Chancellor, David Lloyd George, was already speaking like the war leader Asquith plainly wasn't. While along at the Admiralty, Winston Churchill was hyperactively trying to think of ways to win the war at sea. But it was the Secretary of State for War, the Imperial war hero, Lord Horatio Kitchener, who really understood what Britain was in for.
It was clear to Kitchener that Britain's professional army, 250,000 men compared to Germany's 4.5 million, was nothing like big enough to win the war, and so he set about creating a citizens' army. And he was remarkably successful. "Your country needs you." And his accusing finger had a dramatic effect. By September 1914, 750,000 men had signed up. Kitchener's army would go on to become the biggest volunteer army raised by any country in history.
Goodbye, goodbye. Oh, I'm so dear, baby dear, from your eye. Going hard to pass, I know.
Many men would do anything to fight. Boys lied about their age. Men with health problems did their best to hide them. Recruiting officers were paid a shilling for every new recruit, so they cheerfully played along.
For tens of thousands of young men brought up on stories of British heroism, this was the great adventure. In the words of the future Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, our major anxiety was, by hook or by crook, not to miss it. Little did they know what it would mean.
Within 3 months, the war on the Western Front had frozen into deadlock. The German advance through Belgium and France had been halted. Both sides had dug in. The trenches stretched nearly 500 miles from Ostend in the north all the way to the Swiss border. The meat grinder war had begun. The shock of war was also hitting hard at home. At 8 o'clock in the morning of the 16th of December 1914, 8 German warships appeared off the northeast coast of England. They turned their guns on Scarborough, Whitby and Hartlepool. "127 men, women and children were killed.
These attacks came as a terrible shock. The first time civilians had been killed by enemy fire on British soil since the 17th century. Utter humiliation for the Royal Navy, and above all, further evidence of the beastliness of the enemy. Atrocity stories were spreading around the country like wildfire. Women and children murdered in Belgium. Wounded soldiers bayoneted. And of course, by April 1915, the world's first use of poison gas on the Western Front. Well, war is war, but some of the German tactics did make it easy to hate the Hun.
Then, on the 7th of May 1915, the German Navy torpedoed the Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. She was carrying British and American civilians from New York to Liverpool. Over 1,200 people were killed, 94 of them children, including 31 babies.
When news of the sinking of the Lusitania arrived in Liverpool, a mob formed here at the docks and marched through the town, gathering people as it went. In Edwardian Britain, German migrants had been quite common, running pastry shops and restaurants and butchers, working as musicians or engineers. Now, Germans began to be attacked, their homes and businesses smashed, looted and burned out. The right-wing journalist Horatio Bottomley called for a vendetta against every German in Britain, whether naturalised or not, because he said, you cannot naturalise an unnatural beast, a human abortion, a hellish freak, but you can exterminate it.
If there was hysteria in the country, there was crack-up at the top too.
On the 15th of May, 1915, Lord Jackie Fisher, Britain's first Sea Lord and one of the most brilliant and charismatic men of the age, walked out of the Admiralty buildings and vanished. The man in charge of Britain's awesome battle fleets had disappeared.
Lord Fisher had been appointed First Sea Lord by Winston Churchill in October 1914. They had a passionate, often rocky relationship, but they agreed on one thing. They were both convinced of the need to end the deadlock on the Western Front.
Churchill asked Asquith, are there not other alternatives to sending our armies to chew barbed wire in Flanders? He favoured an attack on Europe's southeastern coast to knock the Ottoman Turks, who were allies of the Germans, out of the war. Fisher thought that was insane. He dreamed instead of a grand royal naval coup, an invasion of Germany's northern coast and then straight to Berlin. Brilliant or bonkers? Well, we'll never know, because Fisher lost the argument.
What we do know is that Churchill's Turkish adventure was a disaster. Hesitation and delay led to the troops landing at Gallipoli 2 months after the first naval bombardment. The Turks were waiting for them. 50,000 British, Australian and New Zealand troops died in the bloodbath.
In the Admiralty, Fisher and Churchill were at each other's throats. At a War Council meeting, Kitchener had to physically prevent Fisher from walking out. Fisher's memos became wilder and wilder, some people thought deranged. He threatened to resign no fewer than 8 times. And then, on that May morning, just as it was becoming clear how bloody the disaster of Gallipoli was, Fisher walked out, apparently into thin air.
Government officials were sent all over London to hunt him down. It turned out that Fisher was in fact hiding just a few hundred yards from the Admiralty in a room here at the Charing Cross Hotel.
When Fisher was finally tracked down, Asquith ordered him in the name of the King to return to his command. By now, there were rumours that the German fleet was at last on the attack. The Queen wrote to Fisher, begging him to stay at his post like Nelson. The King said his admiral should be hanged at the yardarm for desertion.
Fisher sent an ultimatum to Asquith. He would return, but only if Churchill was kicked out of the cabinet. He also demanded absolute control of all naval appointments and sole command of the Royal Navy.
This was the kind of fantasy of a constitutional coup that many generals and admirals might have dreamt about, but nobody, before or since, has actually dared to propose it to a British Prime Minister. The letter was deranged and it finished Fisher. But if Asquith thought the Navy were causing him problems, the Army was about to show what a real crisis looked like.
Just 6 days after Fisher's breakdown, there was uproar on the floor of the London Stock Exchange. Hundreds of men were shouting, jeering, and setting fire to bundles of newspapers.
The burning papers were copies of that day's Daily Mail, whose owner, Lord Northcliffe, had used it to announce a scandal on the Western Front. Lord Kitchener was starving the British Army of high-explosive shells, the kind you need to blow up trenches. The public was outraged, not by that, but by the newspaper's attack on the country's greatest soldier. You can't kick Kitchener.
But Northcliffe could, and he did, and he was essentially right. Kitchener had provided shells that would have been useful in the Boer War in 1900, but against dug-in Germans in 1915 were almost useless. And in some places, they'd run out of shells altogether. Kitchener was increasingly seen as a liability.
Margot Asquith wasn't alone in rudely describing Kitchener as a great poster, not a great man. In public, at least, Asquith himself continued to defend Kitchener, but Northcliffe's attack persuaded the Tory leadership and many Liberals, including Lloyd George, that things couldn't carry on this way.
The mood began to turn against both the warlord Kitchener and his Prime Minister. Asquith survived for now by inviting the Tory leader, Andrew Bonar Law, to join him in a new coalition government of national unity. Kitchener also managed to hang on, unhappily, until his ship hit a mine on a mission to Russia. On the night of the 31st of May 1915, a new terror appeared over London. German Zeppelin airships. Then they began to unload their cargo.
The first bomb ever dropped on London landed here at number 16 Alcombe Road in Stoke Newington. It bounced off a neighbour's chimney, lodged in the rafters and set fire to the upstairs bedroom. The family escaped. Many others didn't. Henry and Caroline Good of 187 Bulls Pond Road in Dalston were discovered by a policeman still kneeling at their bedside. Their bodies charred, their clothes burned away. Mr. Good's arm was still around his wife. They had died while praying.
Visits from Zeppelins would now be a regular occurrence. They became known as the baby killers.
Far fewer people were killed in the First World War by air raids than would be in the Second World War, but in some ways it was even more terrifying. People who'd only just got used to the idea of human flight were confronted by 500-foot balloons lobbing death, and air raid precautions were laughably inadequate. You didn't have much time to scarper.
But the invention of the incendiary bullet gave a way to fight back. In September 1916, millions watched as Lieutenant Leif Robinson attacked a German airship over North London with the new weapon. The inferno could be seen for more than 35 miles in all directions.
The airship crashed to the ground behind this pub, the Plough Inn in the village of Cuffley, and the next day more than 10,000 sightseers swarmed over the wreckage. Plough had soon sold out anything that could be eaten or drunk, and they had to bolt their doors against the crowds. One rather ghoulish highlight was the charred remains of the German airmen. A girl watched a pair of policemen playing ball with their helmets over the charred corpses.
But outproducing the enemy was just as important as outfighting them. Winning an industrial war meant winning industrially. And so the human dynamo, Lloyd George, now asked for the toughest job in politics, sorting out old-fashioned British industry to make more weapons. He built 50 new munitions factories. The largest was here at Gretna in Scotland. These ruined power stations are all that remain now. But in its day, this was the largest factory in the world. It employed 30,000 people and stretched out over an area of 9 miles.
And into his new factories, Lloyd George poured a new workforce. With so many men away fighting, he turned to women. And they flocked into the new jobs. Bus conductors, farm workers, shipyard workers, and 700,000 of them became munitionettes, working in the new munitions factories, which were very dangerous. Explosions, TNT poisoning killed more than 100 women. Many more found their teeth fell out or they turned yellow. They were called canaries. But there were less toxic changes for the new workers too. Women started to cut their hair shorter. They wore simpler clothing. They learned to smoke cigarettes. They learned about condoms. Among the many casualties of the Great War was the Edwardian woman.
As munitions minister, Lloyd George was a phenomenal success. Within a year, the manufacture of heavy guns was up by over 1,000%. Lloyd George was also sketching out a blueprint for a more modern, fairer Britain. He extended welfare help for munitions workers and their families, providing new houses and flats and feeding them in canteens.
Lloyd George chewed over the strange thought that the manufacturing of weapons of destruction was humanising industry. And if you're looking for the real origins of the welfare state, they can be seen most clearly in what Lloyd George was up to in places like Gretna in 1916.
A whole new town was created here to service the factory. With shops, a cinema, and a social hall. To encourage production, Lloyd George introduced British summertime in May 1916. We've had it ever since.
Lloyd George was very worried about the amount munition workers were drinking. And so the state started to take over some pubs, including this one. He banned all-day drinking. That's where pub opening hours come from. He banned the buying of rounds. And yes, he watered the workers' beer. And it wasn't just the workers. Lloyd George wanted leading figures in the country to give up alcohol for the duration of the war, to set an example. And when he heard that the cabinet had agreed to do so, the king reluctantly gave up drink himself. As for the cabinet, they weaseled out. Politicians, eh?
And what these politicians needed were victories, which weren't coming. By February 1916, Asquith was forced to introduce conscription.
So what was it like? What happened here was beyond anybody's imagination. And yet, despite the massive scale, it was in one way strangely familiar, even local. Each 1,000-strong battalion of officers and men defending their own tiny part of the front line became a kind of community. With its class divisions, it was a small piece of Britain transplanted. It wasn't a real Britain. There were no women, no trade unions, no strikes, and very few political arguments because all politicians were pretty much universally despised, along with the staff officers, who were allegedly living it up in Chateau, away from danger.
Pack up your troubles in your old kit bag and smile, smile, smile.
There were some comforts. British troops had rum and cigarettes. They ate better than the Germans and had shorter spells at the front line. Soldiers could send letters and even their dirty linen home. And back came home-baked cakes, family photos and newly knitted socks.
But none of that took away from the utter horror of what happened here. At times, the rain seemed to go on forever, turning the trenches into filthy little rivers infested with rats and lice. The noise was monstrous. Sometimes you could hear the artillery barrage in London. And when the order finally came to go over the top, you had to march steadily into scythe-like machine gun fire.
One war correspondent described the horrors of the front. Human flesh, rotting and stinking, mere pulp, was pasted into the mud banks. If they dug to get deeper cover, their shovels went into the softness of dead bodies who had been their comrades. Scraps of flesh, booted legs, blackened hands, eyeless heads came falling over them when the enemy trench-mortared their position.
So how did these men possibly cope? Religion, yes, but humour was also absolutely essential. Some of it was pretty dark, like the habit of shaking hands with the hands of corpses protruding from the mud. Other times it was lighter. When Captain Fred Roberts discovered a smashed old printing press in the town of Ypres, he decided to mend it and produce his own newspaper. It was called the Wipers Times. Wipers being how the British troops mispronounced Ypres. This was a newspaper from the front, for the front.
Oh, it's a lovely war. Who would be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay.
So how did the men see themselves in the pages of their own local paper? Well, it's all terribly British and understated.
What do we want with eggs and ham? Whipping up plum and ham.
One ad asks, "Are you going over the top? If so, be sure to first inspect our new line of velveteen corduroy plush breeches."
Oh, it's a lovely war.
The Wipers Times is a really important document because it reminds us that in the middle of horror, people were enjoying the same stupid jokes and gossip they always had done. Here's the authentic voice of 1916. 3 Tommies sat in the trench one day discussing the war in the normal way. They talked of the mud and they talked of the Hun, of what was to do and what had been done. They talked about rum. But the point which they argued from post back to pillar was whether Notts County could beat Aston Villa.
Oh, it's a lovely war.
But not all the United Kingdom was so united. In the early hours of Good Friday 1916, a man scrambled off a German U-boat into a small rubber dinghy, and then landed here at Banner Strand on the west coast of Ireland.
He sucked in the fresh Irish air and gloried in the bird song, but not for long. 2 officers of the Royal Irish Constabulary arrived. They'd had a tip-off about a German-sponsored revolt against British rule in Ireland. Quite right. In one of the man's pockets, they found the ticket stub for a railway journey from Berlin to one of the U-boat bases. The weary traveller was promptly arrested, charged with sabotage and treason, and taken to the Tower of London.
The man was Sir Roger Casement, once a loyal servant of the British Empire. An Irishman, he'd become a determined critic of imperialism and joined forces with the Irish Republican movement.
When war broke out, Casement decided that his enemy's enemy would be his friend. So he made his way to Berlin and spoke to the Kaiser's high command about using the German army and navy to help a full-scale Irish rebellion against the British Empire.
In Dublin, the Republicans were also secretly asking for help from the Germans. And they resolved to proclaim a republic at Easter 1916.
When Casement eventually heard about the plan, he went to the Germans to find out how they were going to help. From his point of view, the answer was bad news. 20,000 old rifles, but just enough ammunition for 2 or 3 days of heavy fighting, and above all, no German soldiers at all. This gave Casement a terrible dilemma. Either he'd come back and join a rebellion he knew was going to be a disaster, or he'd seem a coward. He decided to return to Ireland, but to plead with the rebel leaders to delay their uprising, and that was what he was doing here when he was arrested.
In Dublin, the rebels decided to go ahead with the revolt, and on Easter Monday, they rose in rebellion. They occupied key buildings, including the General Post Office, and proclaimed Irish independence. But after the arrival of 20,000 British reinforcements, the rebellion collapsed in 5 days. It had been a small-scale revolt. Just 1,600 rebels compared to the 150,000 Irishmen who'd volunteered to fight for Britain in the war. The Irish, even in the Catholic South, still generally backed the British Empire.
This general goodwill was about to be squandered by an act of brutal British stupidity. The police and the army rounded up 3,500 of the Irish nationalists, whether or not they'd been involved in the uprising. 97 of them were sentenced to death, 16 actually killed. 13 men died here, in one of the courtyards of Dublin's Kilmainham jail. A 14th, James Connolly, one of the leaders, was so badly injured that he had to be tied to a chair so that he could be killed there. These killings changed everything. In the words of one bishop, the blood seemed to be seeping out from under the prison door. They made martyrs of the rebels, and Irish opinion began to swing away from the empire and towards the Republican cause.
In London, there was an influential campaign for clemency for Roger Casement. It was even supported by the King. But then, in a search of his rooms, the police discovered Casement's private diaries. They became known as the Black Diaries.
Casement was a homosexual, and his black diaries listed and described his exploits with scores of young men. As soon as the diaries were in the hands of the British Secret Service, there was no chance of a reprieve, and Casement was duly hanged. His Irish cause, however, would smoulder and fizz all the way to civil war.
On the Western Front, the war was descending into a nightmarish paralysis. It reached its bloodiest with the Somme offensive of July 1916. The idea was to destroy the German trenches with an intensive 7-day bombardment. British troops were told they'd be able to stroll through the shattered German lines and bring the war to an end.
Many of the British troops were absolutely convinced of victory. Captain Billy Neville of the 8th East Surreys painted a football with the words, "Great European Cup Tie Final. East Surreys versus Bavarians. Kick off at 0. Another football was painted with the words, "No referee." And when the attack started, both were kicked over the top. Captain Neville offered a prize for the first British soldier to dribble one of the footballs to the German front line. When he led his men over the top, Captain Neville was killed instantly. So too were 21,000 other British soldiers, most of them within the first hour.
German troops had survived the bombardment in concrete bunkers 10 meters underground. British infantry had walked into an inferno of machine gun fire. The generals have been blamed, callous, stupid, skulking behind the lines. Not quite fair. 78 British generals were killed in the war, and this was a totally new type of dug-in, industrialized slaughter. In 1916, nobody knew how to win this kind of war.
But we're still left with the frightened young officers blowing their whistles and leading their men to death. Take Captain D.L. Martin of the 9th Devons. He'd been a maths teacher before the war, and he used trigonometry and scale models to prove conclusively that an agreed line of attack must end with him and his men being cut down by a particular German machine gun post. He showed his superior officers and was told, "Sorry, you must attack." Captain Martin and 160 of the Devons were killed instantly. They're buried together in a mass grave, above which is written, The Devonshires held this trench. They hold it still.
These disasters had a direct political effect. Asquith had lost his own son in the fiasco of the Somme. Now it would cost him his political career. Lloyd George scented blood.
Was Lloyd George plotting? Lloyd George was always plotting. But the first person to stick in the knife was the press baron. Northcliffe asked the editor of the Daily Mail to find the worst possible picture of Asquith and label it "Wait and See," and then the best possible picture of Lloyd George and call it "Do It Now." And in case anybody failed to get the message, he then wrote a headline which read simply, "Asquith, a limpet." Politicians these days who complain about being roughed up by the press should stay in a little more and read some history.
Lloyd George now joined hands with Andrew Bonar Law and forced Asquith to resign. The King invited Lloyd George to form a new coalition government. The Liberal Party was split down the middle and would never really recover. The Tories were now the majority in Lloyd George's coalition.
With no election, this was a wartime parliamentary coup. The socialist Beatrice Webb wrote in her diary that it was brilliant improvisation, reactionary in composition and undemocratic in form. Lloyd George remade British government. A war cabinet of just 5 men oversaw the fighting, while outside this place, British government power spread to undreamt of degrees. The Edwardian age didn't really end in 1914. It ended with what was, in effect, the first parliamentary dictatorship since the days of Oliver Cromwell, the dictatorship of David Lloyd George.
The first year of Lloyd George's parliamentary dictatorship would be a black one. The Battle of Passchendaele on the Western Front was another bloodbath that achieved little. France was crippled, its army mutinous. Russia, one of the key allies, fell to the Germans, and then to revolution. The United States was doggedly refusing to join the war. And most alarming of all, Britain was running out of food.
The food crisis of 1917 was caused by a step change in German strategy. We tend to think of the U-boat menace as a Second World War affair, but actually the submarines were more dangerous first time round. The Germans knew that Britain imported 2/3 of her food and thought that a slaughter of merchant shipping might bring this country to surrender. But there was a problem. To make that effective, they would have to try to sink all ships coming into British ports, including American ships, which meant risking America coming into the war.
Starving and desperate herself, Germany took the risk. And lost her gamble within weeks, for America at last declared war. Now it was a race to the finish. Could the U-boats defeat Britain before American intervention changed everything? It was a close-run thing. Before long, Britain was running out of fuel and food. Prices shot up and long queues formed outside shops.
Keep the home fires burning while your hearts are yearning, though your lads are far away.
This nation of gardeners pooled together. They turned parks and squares into allotments. And the government set up national canteens, serving cheap meals. And none of it was enough. The U-boats continued to slaughter the merchant ships. What could be done?
The answer was staring the Admiralty in the face, organise the merchant ships in convoys. The Admiralty was sure this wouldn't work. A convoy is a lot bigger than a single ship. Once the U-boats found them, there'd be a turkey shoot. Obvious. But sometimes the obvious is wrong. Set against the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean, a convoy is not much bigger proportionally than a single ship, almost as hard for the U-boats to find, and you can protect a convoy with warships. The Admiralty was pressed into trying this by, among others, Lloyd George himself, and very reluctantly they agreed to give it a go. As soon as they tried the convoy system, the rate of sinkings dramatically decreased, the food started to come through. This single lateral jump of logic may have saved Britain from losing the war.
The beach at Formby, where the Mersey meets the Irish Sea, was a quiet place, even in wartime. In July 1917, a tall, striking-looking officer was walking here alone.
He stopped by the water, shook his fist at the sky, and then he began to tug at a small ribbon on his tunic, which showed that he'd won the Military Cross. And he tore it off and let it drop weakly into the water and watched it float away and sink. The man was Siegfried Sassoon, one of the greatest war poets ever and a hero of the trenches. And he was in the middle of the worst crisis of his young life.
Sassoon was in turmoil about the war. He'd been quick to enlist and was a brave and charismatic frontline leader. But he'd come to believe that the war was being fought for the wrong reasons. At home on leave, he wrote a public statement explaining why he felt he could no longer serve.
A war of defense and liberation, he said, had become one of aggression and conquest. I am protesting against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed, he said, and against the callous complacency with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not sufficient imagination to realize.
Sassoon's statement was all the more explosive because he was a genuine war hero. Now he was determined to be a martyr. He knew he was risking court-martial, imprisonment, and even execution. Instead, the army tried to discredit Sassoon by packing him off to Craiglockett in Edinburgh, a hospital for officers suffering from the newly diagnosed condition of shell shock.
Sassoon called this place Dottyville. He was surrounded by the psychically shattered and shaking victims of the war. But he himself didn't really fit in. He was mentally and physically sound, and he spent his time playing golf, talking to other writers, and producing some of the great war poetry which has made his name live ever since. I see them in foul dugouts, gnawed by rats, and in the ruined trenches, lashed with rain, dreaming of things they did with balls and bats, and mocked by hopeless longing to regain bank holidays and picture shows and spats and going to the office in the train.
Sassoon was speaking out for a small minority. There were 16,000 conscientious objectors who refused to fight. As some people sympathised, most did not. Pacifist meetings were broken up by angry mobs. Conchies, as they were known, were attacked and imprisoned.
For Sassoon, things weren't quite as clear-cut as they were for the conscientious objectors. He was torn between his intellectual contempt for the war and its leaders and his own feelings of comradeship and exhilaration in the trenches. However vile and murderous the fighting was, it gave him more of a sense of being alive than anything here at home among the sheep-like civilians. And in the end, he decided his place was with the fighting men. He returned to the army and eventually to the Western Front, where he survived. But for the rest of his life, he never lost that seething anger with the politicians.
In the spring of 1918, a new German offensive, using troops returning from the Russian front, almost broke the British and the French armies. The new stormtroopers very nearly won the war. The British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, ordered, "With our backs to the wall, each one of us must fight to the end." Back at home, Britain was descending into panic about German spies and saboteurs. In June 1918, a scandalous trial at the Old Bailey threatened to ignite this combustible atmosphere. The man behind the scandal was an eccentric right-wing MP and self-publicist called Noel Pemberton Billing.
Pemberton Billing was obsessed by what he called the hidden hand. He thought the Germans had infiltrated the British establishment. There was a German black book containing the names of 47,000 sexually depraved British men and women who'd been blackmailed into helping Germany win the war. It was, he said, a most Catholic list. It contained the names of privy councillors, cabinet ministers and their wives, diplomats, newspaper proprietors, and even members of His Majesty's household. In short, the Germans had the British establishment over a barrel.
Billing's theory might have been ignored were it not for a private performance of Salome, a band play by Oscar Wilde. Its star was a risque Canadian dancer called Maud Allen. Billing saw an opportunity to promote his obsession and pounced. He implied that Maud Allen was a lesbian and that her audience were among the 47,000 traitors named in the Black Book. Maud Allen took the bait and sued for libel at the Old Bailey.
The British people were transfixed. There were huge daily queues for the public gallery. The atmosphere in court was described as pantomime, circus, farce. The gallery cheered like spectators at a football match. Billing's witnesses claimed that Asquith was in the Black Book, alongside his wife, Margot, and in an extraordinary twist, Billing even claimed that the man presiding over the trial, Britain's most famous judge, Justice Darling, known as Little Darling, was involved as well. This was the conspiracy theory to end them all.
And the British public seemed to be falling for Billing's extraordinary claims about pro-German homosexuals in high places. Anxiety rippled through the corridors of power. There were even fears of a revolution, a people's revolt.
After a 5-day slither of titter, fodder and garbage had gurgled out of the Old Bailey, the jury took just 2 hours to acquit Billing of libelling Maud Allen. The public gallery erupted in joy. As their hero emerged from the Old Bailey, he was mobbed by more than 1,000 supporters. But what of the German Black Book itself that had started it all? Well, there's no evidence that it ever existed. It was almost certainly the fevered figment of one man's imagination, seized upon by a people driven half mad by 4 years of loss and fear and hating.
But by the end of the trial, the fortunes of war were dramatically reversing. In July, the German advance was stopped, and by September, ferocious counterattack by British, Canadian and Australian troops was smashing through German lines. These mostly forgotten battles formed one of the greatest military victories ever won by British forces. Finally, at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, the Germans formally surrendered and signed the armistice. The guns fell silent. To start with, the reaction was celebratory, wild, even drunken. Lloyd George was hailed by the jubilant crowds as the man who won the war. But the crowds quickly sobered up and the mood darkened.
The war had changed Britain in ways that would have been unimaginable 4 years earlier. More than 720,000 people never returned from the battlefields, and those at home lived surrounded by the gaps and the ghosts, those people who should have been in the street or in the factory or down the pub but just weren't there. The civilians had pulled together and worked for the war effort as never before. They'd seen the birth of big government. Perhaps no shock has ever hit these islands with quite the force
of what they called, with, let's hope, an edge of bitter humour, the Great War. In the next programme, cocktails and communists, nightclubs, gold and sleaze.